Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our lectures on our Splendors of Japan and South Korea cruise. My name is Ross Arnold. I will be providing lectures throughout the cruise. I see a number of friendly faces that were on our last leg from Hong Kong to Beijing. So they're going to get a chance to hear any lectures they may have missed, and then maybe some that they wanted to hear again. I don't know exactly why they're here, but we'll find out. Again, I tell you just briefly about myself, my wife Carolyn here, who is the videographer. We videotape these lectures so that we can put them online, and I'll be giving you later on in the cruise the website where you can go on and see these videos and access the PowerPoints that I'm going to be showing you. Plus, this is our 13th cruise for WinStar that I've lectured on. A number of people that we've had on board this last couple of weeks were on previous cruises with us. So all of the lectures that I have done in these 13 cruises and then 3 more that we'll be doing before we get back to Mexico will all be online. So they're plus a lot of other community lectures and things I've done. So there's over 500 hours of video. If you want to go on and check all of that out, a lot of programs on world religions and things of that sort. It's all free of charge. Just help yourself to it. My wife and I live in Mexico. I am the pastor of a church, senior pastor of a church in Mexico, and also the founding director and senior lecturer for a theological institute that we have in Mexico called the Lakeside Institute of Theology. But people always wonder, well, how did you get doing this history and culture stuff? Well, long time ago, in my interest in world religions, as I began to study and teach world religions, I became very interested in the cultures and history behind those religions. And so I began to study the various historical events and the various cultural events that led to that. And on this trip, there'll be a couple of lectures where I talk about the religions of the region as well. But that's a minor part of what we do. I also work as a marketing consultant. So if you have any questions while we're on the cruise about anything, please let me know. So today we're going to be talking about China versus Japan. We have just yesterday left China. We will not be landing again in China, but China has been such a major influence on the various other countries here in East Asia, particularly Korea and Japan. China has been the source of a lot of the cultural impact. Japan, for instance, still today uses a lot of Chinese language characters in their Japanese language. And so the religions of this region primarily have come through China, if not from China. And so we'll learn a little bit about that as we go along. This is the route that we're on, of course. We left Beijing. We are headed right now to Karatsu in Japan, and then back over to Jeju City in Korea, Busan, and then through the inner passages in Japan. And so we'll be having various talks about that as we go along. This is the list of the talks that we're planning for this cruise. There are, I believe, 11 of these. So starting off with China versus Japan. And tomorrow I will be doing 2 lectures, and that's true for most C days. It'll be at 11 and 5, 11 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. And since we haven't gotten anywhere else yet, I'm going to do 2 more lectures about China. Just pick you up on some things because these are topics people are interested in. So we'll do a brief history of China, and then Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. The Opium Wars, in which Britain literally twice went to war with China to force them to import opium. If that's a surprise to you, then make sure you make it to the lecture tomorrow at 5. And then later on, the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese rebellion against foreigners and foreign religion and whatnot, and the results of that. I should find out if they could get the movie, Charlton Heston's movie, 55 Days in Peking. You know that movie? That's about the Boxer Rebellion. So if you're familiar with that, that's what we're going to be talking about. Then we have 2 talks on Korea, a brief history of Korea, and then the Forgotten War, the Korean conflict. We then get into Japanese things, the emperors and shoguns, a brief history of Japan, a talk on the birth of the atomic age, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's before we arrive at Nagasaki. So we'll talk about how all that came about, and including some of the ethical questions that have continued to be brought up about whether or not it was appropriate for the atomic bombs to be used in the Second World War, the only time in history that nuclear weapons have been used in conflict. Then Religions of Japan, Islands of Tranquility, Japanese Gardens. So you'll have an opportunity to see some spectacular gardens here. When we go to Osaka, there's a trip to Kyoto, and I've told Anna and Christy that if I have to kill another guest in order to be able to go to Kyoto for this, then I will do so. No, it's something I've always wanted to do. I've not been to Kyoto, and so I'm looking forward to it, primarily because Kyoto, one of the ancient capitals of Japan, we'll talk about the Heian period when they were in Kyoto as the capital, the beautiful gardens and the temples and the shrines in Kyoto. In fact, Kyoto was proposed as one of the sites for them to drop the atomic bomb, and the Secretary of War, Stimson, I believe he and his wife had honeymooned there, and so he said, absolutely not. You cannot destroy Kyoto. It is too beautiful. And so that they got saved from the horrendous effect that Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered. Then we will talk about samurai and the code of Bushido, Japanese art and architecture, and the Pacific War. There are 4 or 5 of these that are brand new. So for the people who, we had over 60 people who continued from the last cruise to this one. And so they've heard some of these lectures. Those of you who just got on board, they're all new to you. So I hope you'll make a point of trying to come to them. But today we want to talk about particularly the China versus Japan. The 2 wars, Sino-Japanese wars, meaning China and Japan. And then in between those 2, another war I want to mention to you, which has been called the most important historically most important war that nobody knows about, which was the Russo-Japanese War, when Russia and Japan fought in 1904, 1905. And so we'll get into that because all 3 of these conflicts, the first and second Chinese-Japanese War and then the Russian-Japanese War in the middle of those 2, all had major effects, not only on this region, but on world politics, world development, and so we'll get into that. This picture is of the Meiji Emperor and his family. It was taken in the 1880s. The Meiji Emperor became the emperor in 1866, and there was an event then called the Meiji Restoration. What had happened, stepping back from that, in 1603, a new shogun had taken over, the Tokugawa shoguns. Now the shoguns were military rulers, and from the late 1100s until the late 1800s, the country of Japan was run not by the emperor, but by the shogun, the military leader. You've all seen the James Clavell novel and maybe the miniseries Shogun. Well, the shoguns were the ones that were running the country. The emperor was only a figurehead. Well, in 1866, there was a new emperor, the Meiji Emperor, and you'll notice their clothing. They're wearing very Western, for the 1800s, very Western style clothing for the most part, except for the children. Well, in 1866, the Meiji Emperor came in, and there was a rebellion by some of the other warlords in Japan. They were called daimyos, and you'll hear these terms when we talk about the history. The daimyos were the regional military rulers, and the shogun was the national military ruler. And the emperor was just a figurehead. He really did not have any influence at all. In 1853, a very unusual thing happened. Well, first, when the Tokugawa shoguns took over in 1603, they closed Japan. It's called the period of the Sakaguru. It's the closing down or isolationism. And Japan had no interaction with the outside world. Nagasaki was the only port that they allowed the Dutch to trade in, but almost nobody else could do any trading at all. In 1853, so after almost 250 years of being cut off from the outside world, 4 gunships with Commodore Matthew Perry, an American with 4 American gunships, cruised into Edo Harbor, which is the harbor for Tokyo, and insisted on seeing the emperor. Well, the emperor didn't see anybody, so they took him before. He finally convinced them to take him before the shogun. He met with the shogun and said, you see those big guns on those cruisers out there? Now remember, it's been over 200 years that Japan has been isolated, so they have not advanced. Their weapons have not advanced, their military has not advanced, they're still way behind the times in terms of the rest of the world. Well, Matthew Perry, the Commodore from the United States, instituted what later became known as gunboat diplomacy, saying, we really want to trade with you. We want you to open your ports and allow us to come in and trade with you. And if you don't, well, gosh, I'd hate to have to use those gunboats. He gave them a year, he said, to consider. And he only gave them 6 months. He came back 6 months later, and this time he brought 7 gunboats. At that point, having seen how far behind they were militarily, the shogun, the military ruler of Japan, decided he really didn't think he had any choice but to let America start trading, and so they opened up the country. That was in 1853. Some of the other warlords in the country got mad at the shogun because he allowed a foreign power to tell him what to do. And they didn't particularly like having this guy over them anyway. So in 1866, two of the primary daimyos from the south, Satsuma and Chosun daimyos, these are warlords, they have their own samurai armies. Every daimyo, every warlord had their own army. These two daimyos got together and recruited some other samurai, and they went to war, the Boshin War, in 1868 against the shogun, and they defeated him. In 1869, they declared the shogun was no longer in power, and it's called the Meiji Restoration because they said now, for the first time since the late 1100s, the emperor is running the country. Well, much to their surprise, the Meiji emperor decided, having seen what Western military power looked like in terms of gunboats, that they had to start modernizing. That's why they're wearing modern clothes and modern hairdos, modern in terms of a Western style. And so they started changing Japan from being an agrarian culture, which was feudalistic, meaning they had clear class structures. Beneath the emperor, the shogun, the daimyos, there were the samurai, and then there were the farmers, and there were the peasants, and then the lowest level at all was the merchants. They didn't think much of people who didn't make something, they just sold it. That changed in Japan after a while. But the Meiji Restoration established that the emperor was in control, and in fairly short order, he got rid of all of that. He got rid of the position of shogun, he got rid of the title of daimyos, he got rid of the samurai. They were all demoted into lower positions, and they had universal education, they had equality between the sexes. He started bringing in military advisors from Western powers like Germany and France and Britain to teach in their military schools. He sent delegations of people around the world to various modernized countries to learn from them. And in a period of only about 30 years, Japan went from an isolated, 200-year behind agrarian culture to being a modern, industrialized, manufacturing-based country, as we think of them today. Well, the problem for Japan is that while they moved toward manufacturing, they wanted to be able to produce weapons in order to modernize their army. Japan has very little natural resources. They have no coal, they have no oil, they have no iron. All things that you need if you're going to be an industrialized nation. So they looked at all the Western powers, and what did the Western powers do about that? Well, it was clear to them that in the West, if they wanted something, these industrialized nations, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, they simply took it because they were more powerful. And this was the time of the imperialist age where they would simply come in, and China had gone through a period called the period of the unequal treaties. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Opium Wars tomorrow afternoon. Well, China looks around, and the very closest place that had coal and oil and steel, or iron that they could make steel from, was Korea. Korea at that point was a tribute state, meaning they were under the power of, although they were an independent nation formally, and the Koreans would insist on that, still they were pretty much directed and controlled by China. This was the time of the Qing Chinese dynasty. It is the last of the imperial dynasties of China. Later on, in 1911-12, they ended up getting rid of the imperial dynasties and having the Republic of China. But Japan looked at Qing China, the Qing dynasty of China, and realized that they had been defeated, we're talking now in the late 1800s, they had been defeated twice by the British in the Opium Wars, and had proven, and everybody saw this, prior to this, China was thought to be the power in the East. That they had the largest army, they were thought to be the power, that they had influence over all the other countries. All of a sudden, they end up being beaten in short order by Britain, and Japan said, now that we've modernized our military, now that we have gotten our act together on this, then maybe we need to do what we can to get Korea out from under the control of China so that we can begin to access the resources there. So in 1875 and 76, by that time they had started sending legations, ambassadors and whatnot into Korea, Japan was sending them there. And they began to convince part of the political leaders in Korea that they should side with Japan and not with China. Well, Korea was sort of back and forth and back and forth. They actually developed two parties, one pro-China party and one pro-Japan party. In 1875 and 76, Japan forced Korea to declare their independence from China and to open their borders to trade with Japan, which was a good start. But it still didn't give Japan everything they wanted. So there was a period in which they had lots of conflict because there were Japanese troops and political people in Japan. There were Chinese troops and political people. And they would, argue with each other over the rights to various trade agreements and they went back and forth and back and forth. And they would have violence flare up. And it looked like they were just at the point of having a war at any time. And then finally, they signed an agreement, Japan and Korea, that they would all remove their troops and they would not send them back. This was the Lee-Ito Treaty. And after the Lee-Ito Treaty, they agreed neither of the two countries, China nor Japan, can send troops into Korea without the other side saying it's okay. Well, unfortunately for China, they had a rebellion in Korea called the Dongtak Rebellion, which was a religious sort of based, and it scared the government of Korea. And without thinking, they asked China for help, and China sent troops in. Japan said, whoa, wait a minute. You're not supposed to be sending troops in there unless you talk to us first, and you didn't say anything. These are images, by the way, from the various problems they had where the Japanese legation had to run for their lives at one point because they were attacked by Chinese and all sorts of things going on. Well, in 1894, after all of this problem with the Chinese coming in with troops and then the Japanese sent their troops in August of 1894, they declared war against each other, Japan and China. Now, nobody thought that Japan stood a chance. China was so big, it had been the power in this part of the world for centuries, and they had a huge army. But unfortunately, the Qing dynasty of China had been trying to modernize their military, but they had not been successful. Japan had been successful. Their manufacturing, their industrialization had all gone to plan. Their military was much more powerful. So when they declared war, this is a modern map, obviously, because it shows North and South Korea, but I put that up there because we started in Beijing, or actually in Shenzhen here, and Dalian, and there's another port there which today is called Lushan, and that was originally called Port Arthur. Well, the Koreans landed in, the Japanese landed in Korea, went up through Korea, and came back around to this, which is called the Liaotong Peninsula. They captured the peninsula, they crossed over, took over part of mainland, they invaded Taiwan, and in 6 months, the tiny country of Japan, with their new modernized military, defeated the giant of the East, China, in the first Sino-Japanese War. And it's pretty easy to see why, because various images and paintings that they had of that time, you'll notice that the Japanese soldiers look like fairly modern soldiers. Their uniforms are not that different than any of the Western uniforms would have been in the early 1900s. And the Chinese, on the other hand, are still in very traditional dress. Their weapons were outmoded. They were still using very primitive weapons compared to Japan, with their relations with Great Britain and France and other places, had gotten modern warships, they had gotten modern weapons, they had done a great job of modernizing. And so you can see from the images the differences in the very traditional Chinese army against the very modern Japanese army. So in 6 months, China was defeated by Japan. This was a cartoon that came out at that time, little tiny Japan standing on the chest of great big China. No one thought this was going to happen, other than perhaps the Japanese. And so at that point, Japan took control of Korea, and they also took control of part of Manchuria, which is where that Liaodong Peninsula sticks down from. Manchuria is the northeastern corner of China today. And so they took over part of that as well, which is, that's where Korea connects to the Asian mainland. So this all seemed great, and Japan ended up with getting Taiwan. China made all sorts of concessions. They gave Taiwan to China, they gave the Pescadores Islands to them, they gave property up north of the island of Hokkaido, the northernmost island in the Japanese islands, and they also gave them control of the Liaodong Peninsula. Well, Russia comes in the picture here, because Russia had their own idea about wanting to take over property there. They particularly were concerned because the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Navy, which was huge, was based in Vladivostok, which is just north up the coast from Japan. Well, Vladivostok is only a warm water port. In other words, it doesn't, in the wintertime it freezes. You can't get in and out of there with ships. And so the Russians were really wanting to get control of a port further south so that they would have year-round ability to keep their fleet moving. So they went to France and went to Germany. That is, the Russians went to France and Germany and got them to back them, approaching the Japanese and saying, do not take over the Liaodong Peninsula. Because they didn't say this, but it was because they wanted it. So Japan, even though they just won the battle against giant China, they didn't feel like they could take on three major Western powers, Russia, France, and Germany. And so they backed off. Well, almost immediately, Russia signs an agreement with China with a 25-year lease of the Liaodong Peninsula so that they have control of it, and they start building a major naval base at Port Arthur. The Japanese keep trying to tell them, you know, we'll leave you alone. You can have Manchuria, you can have control of the Liaodong Peninsula. We won't argue about this or fight about it if you'll give us control of Korea. Well, the problem was, because that was where the minerals and oil and whatnot that they wanted were, the problem was that the Russians they didn't even consider the Japanese worth negotiation. Tsar Nicholas II refused to even talk to them about it. In fact, at one point he referred to the fact that those little yellow monkeys will do what I tell them, and if they don't, we'll just step on them. We'll crush them. And during this period of time, there were all sorts of these propaganda posters that show the Russians punching the Japanese in the nose, picking them up and shaking them, looking at them like a little dog. The Russians thought, Tsar Nicholas thought, they're not even worth bothering with. And so he wouldn't even negotiate with them. And he insisted that they would have rights to at least the northern part of Korea, and he called it a buffer zone. But mostly, the Japanese are frustrated because they won't take them, the Tsar will not take them seriously at all. And not only the Tsar, but the various military leaders in Russia clearly were racist. They didn't think that the Japanese had any chance against them, and they'll just shut up and do what we tell them. Well, unfortunately for Russia, the Japanese finally reached a point where they said, we're going to have to do something about this. We cannot allow this to continue because they'll take over all of Korea and we'll be shut out and not have the resources we need. So, we end up in 1904, the Japanese launched a surprise attack. Sound familiar? The Japanese launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur, which is right here. That was the warm water port that they had been building. Vladivostok is up here, and it's iced in the wintertime. So they wanted a southern port. The Japanese, using torpedo boats and mini submarines, attacked Port Arthur in 1904. They severely damaged several capital ships, major ships. And then they mined the harbor and had their fleet outside those mines. And the Russians at one point tried to sail some of their battleships out. One battleship was destroyed by the mines. Another was so severely damaged it had to be towed back into Port Arthur. And the primary military leader at Port Arthur, who was an admiral, a Russian admiral, was killed during their attempt to break out. Well, there was a deadlock here because the Russians couldn't get out of the port with their ships, but the Japanese couldn't attack the port because on the hills above Port Arthur, the Russians had heavy artillery. And so they had the ability to shoot down at the Japanese if they try to come into the harbor. Well, the Japanese, being very determined, as they always have been, they decide that they are going to, and they do it, they march up through Korea and come down behind Port Arthur. And you can see all these stars. They win battle after battle against the Russian military. Now they're losing a lot of their soldiers. The Japanese had 500,000 casualties in the Russo-Japanese War in Manchuria. But still, the generals and military leaders of the Russians continued to underestimate the Japanese, and so they won every battle. They get down to Port Arthur, and they have to attack these hilltops from behind, which had the artillery on them. And it was a horrendous battle. They took them a while to succeed. But when they finally did succeed, they took the high ground, and they had control of the artillery. Now they had their navy outside the harbor, and they could shoot down on the Russian ships. They sank 4 Russian battleships, 2 mainline cruisers, and a lot of other ships. In effect, they destroyed the whole Russian Pacific Fleet. And at that point, the military commander, the army commander, who's a major general, Anatoly Stessel, he felt like, well, you know, this Port Arthur primarily was because of the fleet. The fleet's gone. We're losing a lot of soldiers here, so he surrenders Port Arthur without asking either Tsar Nicholas or his military superiors. So he later on, Major General Stessel, the Russian general, was prosecuted for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Later on he got reprieved. But the Russians did not take this well. When Tsar Nicholas heard that the Japanese had attacked Port Arthur, and by the way, when they attacked Port Arthur in a surprise attack, the Russians said, "That's not fair." And the Japanese said, "You remember in 1808 when you attacked Sweden without telling them first? That's exactly what we just did." And it was not part of international law until 1907 that it was considered against international law to attack without declaring war first. So there weren't even any rules at that point. But the Japanese were quick to remind the Russians that we just did to you what you did to the Swedes a century ago. So they now have control of Port Arthur and the Liaodong Peninsula, but Tsar Nicholas was, to quote one of my, some of our Canadian friends, he was gobsmacked. You know, gobsmacked? Meaning absolutely flabbergasted. All of his advisors said, there's no way the Japanese are going to attack us. There's no way they're not going to do what we tell them. He didn't think they would, and when they did attack, and they ended up taking Port Arthur and destroying the Pacific Fleet of the mighty Russian Navy, he was just astonished, and he was not going to take it lying down. Well, this obviously is Korea and Japan, and that's where they destroyed right up here is where they destroyed the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Navy. Well, they had 2 other major fleets. They have a fleet in the Black Sea, and they had a fleet in the Baltic Sea. So the Tsar tells his Baltic fleet, I want you to go over there and show those Japanese what for. They sail halfway around the world because the Russians had offended the British. The British didn't let them use the Suez Canal, so they had to sail all the way around Africa, all the way up through here. It took them over 7 months. Well, the Japanese intelligence was really good. They knew where this Baltic fleet of the Russian Navy was the whole time. So the Baltic fleet gets up here, finally, and they decide they're going to go through the Tsushima Straits, which is right in between Japan and Korea. The Japanese Navy was waiting for them. And they, in the tactical terms, they crossed the T, meaning the Russian ships were sailing in a straight line up through the Tsushima Straits. The Japanese aligned themselves across that, which means only the front ship of the Russians could fire, but all of the Japanese ships could fire on the Russian line of ships. The Japanese destroyed the whole Baltic fleet in the Tsushima Straits. 2 of Russia's 3 fleets have now been destroyed by the little yellow monkeys, as Tsar Nicholas called them. And Tsar Nicholas is fit to be tied, as you can imagine, because he was considered one of the most powerful leaders in the world up till that time. Didn't last too much longer. You know, the Russian Revolution happened a few years later. But at this point, the United States President, Teddy Roosevelt, stepped in and offered to mediate peace between the Japanese and the Russians. Tsar Nicholas jumped at that. He thought this is because they were friends. The US and Russia were friends. Teddy Roosevelt got a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to try to bring peace between Russia and Japan. But unfortunately, he was biased in favor of the Russians. And so in the negotiations, as he mediated, he insisted that the Japanese did not have a right to claim reparations. In those days especially, and all the way up through the end of the 20th century, whenever a war was held, the winner usually had a right to claim reparations. In other words, make the loser pay for stuff. Well, Teddy Roosevelt insisted that the Russians didn't have to pay reparations, which made the Japanese mad, and in the process, the seeds were planted for both world wars to come. Russia, for instance, thought that the Germans had helped the Japanese in this war, and so they decided they were going to be friends with the French against their enemies, the Germans. And so, in the First World War, Russia came into the war partly because they were defending France as an ally. In addition, when the Second World War comes along, you've got Japan is still holding a grudge against the United States for all sorts of things, most especially because they felt like they had been cheated when the American president had negotiated this peace. So there were all sorts of factors in here that led to further conflicts down the road. But the one thing that did happen that the Japanese benefited from is they did take over all the areas that the Russians had been controlling. They took over the Liaodong Peninsula. They took over control, really, of Korea at that point. And in fact, they instituted massive changes in Korea. Some of them sound very good. They instituted universal education. They got rid of the slave trade that Korea had previously. A lot of other positive changes, but Japan treated Korea like they were, redheaded stepchild. They really did not treat the Koreans well. They were as racist against the Koreans as the Russians had been against the Japanese. And so it was a very harsh regime they had over the Koreans. But they did take over the Liaodong Peninsula, which gave them what they were looking for. Now, I'll explain this in a second. One of the things that Russia had done when they were controlling part of Manchuria is they had extended a railway down into there, the East China Railway. Well, when Japan defeated the Russians and the Russians left and the Japanese took over, they extended that railway down south into Manchuria, all the way down into the Liaodong Peninsula. It was called the South Manchurian Railway, and they developed a corporation, the South Manchurian Railway Corporation. Over a period of the next 25 years or so, the South Manchurian Railway Corporation, which was entirely controlled by Japan, became the richest, most powerful corporation in all of Asia. They not only owned railways, they owned ports, they ran various industries, and they got very, very wealthy. And in the process, they were bringing in more and more Japanese to live in Manchuria in order to run their businesses. Now, the Japanese were always the bosses. The people who did the common work were always Chinese or Koreans. Again, this was reinforcing this kind of racist idea that the Japanese felt that they were superior, and so therefore they would have the senior jobs. At a certain point, they decided it didn't make sense anymore for them to just, be in somebody else's country since this was China. So in 1931, in September of 1931, there was something called the Mukden Incident, or the Manchurian Incident, where a lieutenant in the Japanese army set off some explosives close to, but not damaging, the rail line, the South Manchurian rail line. China immediately jumped on this, and it was just a pretext. The Japanese planned this. The Japanese jumped on this and said, we've got insurgent there, we need to send our army in. So they sent their army in force, which they had not done before, and they ended up controlling all of Manchuria. 6 months after the Mukden incident, which was a pretext for the military taking over, they created a puppet regime, which was called Manchukuo. Manchukuo was at first they said it was going to be a republic, and then they ended up recruiting the former emperor of China, the Qing emperor of China, Pu Yi. You saw the movie The Last Emperor? Well, Pu Yi had stepped down in 1911 as the last emperor in China when they declared it to be a republic, and they declared right after that a republic. Well, in 1931, they invite Pu Yi to come and be the emperor of Manchukuo. So the Japanese have a puppet ruler who was the previous, and he was Manchurian. He was a Manchu or Yurkin. The Qing dynasty was not native Chinese. It was from a different racial group, the Manchurians or Manchus, and so Puyi fit right in Manchukuo because that was his land. So they're running a puppet regime there, and starting in 1931. In 1932, the League of Nations, which existed then, they created a commission to go in and find out about this, because here you got Japanese taking over a huge part of China and turning it into their own puppet regime. So the League of Nations has what they call the Lytton Commission, and they go in and investigate this. In 1932, the Lytton report comes out, and it says it's all a hoax. Japan planned this. It was only a pretext. They have no right there. They had no legitimate reason to go into the country, and they should leave. So the League of Nations orders Japan to leave China. Other countries, including the United States, start saying, you need to get out of there. You have no business. You've taken over somebody else's country. And Japan goes, neener, neener. That was the political expression at the time, neener, neener. They said, forget it. We're not going to do that. So in 1933, they leave the League of Nations. They no longer have any official contact with the West. But the West, including the United States, starts taking action because Japan has taken over part of China. They have embargoes against oil, which is one of the things they desperately need in Japan. They start having various other kinds of limitations, trade embargoes, trade limitations, and Japan begins to suffer from this. Then in July 1937, when all of this is getting hotter and hotter all the time, there was another incident called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. July 1937, the Japanese are in Manchuria, and one of their soldiers goes AWOL. And the army thinks that he's inside this town. It's a walled town. So they insist that they go in and find him. The Chinese military is there, and they won't let him in. So they start trying to go over the walls. People start shooting, and it turns into a full-blown second war between China and Japan. So this is the second Sino-Japanese War. This map gives you, obviously you've got Japan here. This is Korea, which is controlled by Japan at that point. All of Manchuria, which is called Manchukuo, and they begin to move because at that point when Japan declares war, this is 1937, so you know what's going on in the world then. They've already got war brewing in Europe as well. Japan signs treaties with Germany and Italy. They became part of the Axis powers. And Japan decides to get the resources they need, they're going to have to get more aggressive, particularly because the Western powers are trying to cut them off from oil, from steel, from coal. So they end up taking over a lot of French Indochina, Burma, Thailand, British Malaya, and they're moving further and further into China itself. In China, they refer to this, the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, as the 14-year war, because they believe it started in 1931 when the Japanese first came into Manchuria and took it over. And so they refer to this as the 14-year war in China. For most of the West, we think of this war as starting in 1937, and so it ended up being an 8-year war, because 1945, the Japanese, of course, were defeated. Here you have two images from Japan and from China, patriotic posters of their conflict against one another. The Japanese aggression in China really had three distinct phases. First, there was the 1937 and 1939, there was a rapid expansion of Japan's efforts. Then from 1939 to 43, there was a period of sort of stalemate because Japan succeeded in conquering most of the western cities and northern cities, but they couldn't control that much countryside. And then finally the Allied counterattack in 44 and 45. And in the process of them taking over the cities of North and East China, the Japanese were brutal, as I'm sure you've heard the stories. One of the the stories that epitomizes the brutality is known as this, I didn't remember I had the slide in here. This is where they were getting all of the northern and eastern cities, and you'll notice down here, even when they weren't controlling the countryside, they were taking over the ports. And down here, Hong Kong. The rape of Nanjing, which happened from December 1937 to January 1938, the armies of Chiang Kai-shek. We'll talk about the history of China and a little bit about the Chiang Kai-shek against the communists. But Chiang Kai-shek removed his troops from Nanjing, which was or Nanking, it's had both names, because it had been the capital, but he didn't feel like they could defend it against the Japanese. When the Japanese came in, before they were done, and over a 2-month period, estimates vary, but estimates are between 40,000 and 300,000. The official estimates are between 200 and 300,000 civilians were killed. The Japanese were doing things like having competitions for their officers as to how many could kill, or competitions as to who could kill the most civilians with a sword. And it was being put in the newspapers in Japan, these competitions that were running. Up to 80,000 women were raped, and in almost every case, the women who were raped were killed after that. 1/3 of the city was completely destroyed, and this was the time when the Japanese military issued what's called the 3 Alls order with regard to their approach to not only Nanking, but other cities. The 3 Alls were kill all, loot all, burn all. That was an official order. And they believe that 2.7 million people were killed, not just in Nanjing, but elsewhere in China, as a direct result of that 3 Alls command. So at this point, again, Japan controlled most of the cities in the east and north, but they could not control all of the countryside. At this point, when we think, we Americans particularly, or Australians or others probably, that were part of the Allies, when we think of Japan, we think of the Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, which is always IJN if you're reading anything about it, because the Navy is the part that we were concerned about fighting primarily in the Pacific. But the Japanese Army, whereas the Japanese Navy was concerned about America as being the primary Pacific Ocean military power, but the Japanese Army was concerned about Russia. And so most of the Japanese Army was in Manchuria and in China, not in, we didn't get involved in them. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that one of the real fears that people had about invading China at the end, invading Japan at the end of the Second World War, was that most of the Japanese Army was still intact because they were in China. The Japanese Navy had been defeated, but the Japanese Army was mostly still intact, and there was a real concern about that. And during this period of time, to complicate matters even further, we did have a civil war going on, starting in 1930 to 1937. The Communist Party of China and the nationalist, or Kuomintang it was called, of Chiang Kai-shek were fighting a civil war. That's from 30 to 37. In 1937, they agreed to have a united front against the Japanese. They said, that's our biggest enemy. So they start fighting together, but they're still fighting each other. They kept having flare-ups of these two armies fighting. In 1945, when Japan is finally defeated, they start the Civil War back up, and it goes from 45 to 49. These pink areas here in 1941 were all that the Chinese Communist Party of China controlled. The blue area here, and then Hong Kong and these port cities, were where the Japanese were in control, and the rest of this was, at least in name, was controlled by the nationalists, the Chiang Kai-shek and his forces. But the whole thing was driven by the fact that Japan wanted to carve up China and to use the resources of China as it already was with Korea for their own benefit, the imperialism. On August 6th of 1945, the first atomic bomb ever used was dropped on Hiroshima. 2 days later, on August 8th, the USSR had promised the Western powers that when Germany was defeated, they would come in against the Japanese. Well, Germany had been defeated by this time. The Allied troops got notification during the Battle of Okinawa, which was the last major battle of the Pacific War, that Germany had been defeated. So on August 8th, the Russians start invading Manchuria. On August 9th, Nagasaki is bombed, the second of the nuclear weapons. On August 14th, 5 days later, the Japanese say they are prepared to surrender. On September 2nd, the official surrender happened. But again, remember, in China, the Japanese army, the vast part of the Japanese army was still intact. And when the emperor, which was completely unheard of, when he stepped in and told his military advisors, it's time for us to accept the peace offering from the Potsdam Conference, and the emperor never did that. The emperor never got involved in those kinds of details or any sort of power thing. They played a recording of his voice saying, as hard as it is, we have to accept the terms of surrender. There were a number of major efforts, coup efforts, in Japan to try to prevent Japan from accepting the peace agreement, not to have to surrender. There were senior officers at first, then junior officers of the army later, because they're all saying, we've still got an army in China. Why are we giving up? A lot of the Air Force was still intact, and they didn't want to give up either. Finally, they were able to quell all of that. The Second Sino-Japanese War, if you're not Chinese, we think of as lasting for 8 years, 2 months, and 2 days. There were 35 million killed in the Sino-Japanese War. That doesn't count the people that were killed in the Pacific battles. This is the land battles. 35 million killed, the majority of them were Chinese civilians, 1.1 million Japanese. More than half of all the fatalities in the Pacific theater of war in the Second World War happened on mainland China, not in the Pacific battles. So more than half the casualties were on land. Then the Civil War, as I mentioned, continued. The Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, who had been the official government of China, handled things very badly. They allowed inflation to go nuts, so the people didn't want to support them because their money wasn't worth anything anymore. They allowed themselves to be sort of beaten from pillar to post by the Japanese, while the communists were sort of laying back and preserving themselves. And so finally, on October 1st of 1949, Chairman Mao announced from Tiananmen Square, if you were just in Beijing, you may have visited there, the formation of the People's Republic of China, which we know of as Communist China. Today it is mainland China. On December 8th of 1949, just a couple of months later, the Chiang Kai-shek and 7 million of his people moved to Taiwan and created the Republic of China, which is today why there are still 2 Chinas. And we have today unified China, well, unified including even Tibet, some areas we're not sure should be unified, and then Taiwan as the Republic of China. So People's Republic on mainland, the Republic of China in Taiwan. 46 minutes. I usually shoot for 45, so my apologies. Questions on any of that?
Yes.
Yes?
I didn't hear anything about, you didn't mention anything about Pearl Harbor.
Right, because that wasn't part of the Chinese war. That was not part of Japan versus China. I will talk about Pearl Harbor later on. The last lecture I'm going to do is the Pacific War, and I'll talk about probably 5 battles that were major battles, including Pearl Harbor in the Second World War. But I didn't get into the Pacific part where the Allies are fighting the Japanese because the Sino-Japanese War happened all on mainland. But we will get to that. Yes?
Will you get into the point, which I don't know well, where the Koreans became divided? They were once united.
Right.
When did they separate?
When did Korea get divided? Well, when did they become North Korea and South Korea? This happened after the end of the Second World War. I just mentioned that the Russians had begun to move into Manchuria. Well, the Americans and the Russians at that point agreed that they would take sort of stewardship, that they would, for a period of time, and they agreed, they didn't say how long, but they agreed, the Russians and the Americans agreed, we will sort of nurture the southern part of the country. You, since you're already there, Russians take care of the northern part of the country. Well, after a period of time, the Russians clearly indicated they were not prepared to lead. And in the South, they got tired of waiting, and they ended up having democratic elections. And they elected a government in the South, and they had split at the 38th parallel. Now, earlier, the Russians had used the 39th parallel as the divider between them and Japan's control area. So the 38th parallel, north of that, the Russians were in charge. South of that, the Americans were in charge, but we quickly moved to having a democratic election, although the early South Korean governments were not very democratic, okay? Still, that conflict happened when both Communist China and Russia were supporting the northern part of Korea, And Stalin gave approval to Kim Sung-il, the person they had put in charge, because they handpicked him as somebody they felt they could control, and they put him in charge of North Korea. Stalin gave him permission to invade the South, and that was the start of the Korean War in 1950. So it was between 1945, when the Japanese surrendered, and 1950, when the Korean War broke out, that Russian influence, and then later Chinese influence as well, communist Chinese influence after 1949, caused the North to be communist. The Americans and then the United Nations were involved in the South, and it became democratic. And that split has continued. I'm going to do a talk about the Korean War, and I'll get into that a little bit. Is that fair?
Yes.
Other questions? I appreciate very much you being here. Tomorrow we will have 2 more lectures at 11 and 5. It's great to have you all here for the first lecture. The challenge is always to see how many of you come back for the second lecture. So I hope to see you all tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Thanks very much.